Okay, so as we finished up yesterday, they've gotten over the Lolo Pass. They are now spending time with the Nez Perce Indians. They're going to spend about 2 weeks there. And the Nez Perce chief told Lewis and Clark that the rest of the journey would be best served by water routes. So remember, they allowed them to cut down 5 trees and carve them into canoes. So the expedition was directed by the Nez Perce chief to go down the Clearwater River to the Snake River, and then eventually hook on to the Columbia River, which would take them to the Pacific. Now, they get on the proposed route, and they travel for about 2 months. And what do they notice about the water? Becomes salty. Very good, thank you. Mason, good job. So they travel for about 2 months, and notice that the water becomes salty, meaning that they're close to the ocean. So they travel down the Columbia River, and all of a sudden, after 2 months of travel on the Clearwater, and then the Snake, and then the Columbia, they notice the water's becoming salty, knowing that they're closer to the ocean. So on November 7th, 1805, on November 7th of 1805, the Corps of Discovery reached the shores of the Pacific Ocean. On November 7th, 1805, the Corps of Discovery reaches the shores of the Pacific Ocean. November 7th, 1805. So they have traveled 4,162 miles from the mouth of the Missouri River near St. Louis to the Pacific. 4,162 miles is what they had traveled from the mouth of the Missouri River near St. Louis, Missouri to the Pacific, 4,162 miles. Now this is kind of interesting. How do they choose where they're going to camp for the winter? Exactly. Because they got to the Pacific and they're going to stay there for the winter because it's November. How do they choose that? How do they choose where they're going to stay? The site they're going to stay at. What? The boats got frozen in the water. Not exactly, but how would they choose? This is really an interesting story. What? They vote. They vote. So here's the thing in history. Think about this. This really was the first time in history that a black man or an Indian woman had an opportunity to vote. So remember, blacks couldn't vote all the way through for, almost near present history. But in this particular vote, one of the most historic trips in our nation's history, a black man and an Indian woman had the right to vote. And the place they chose was called Fort Clatsop. And it was in honor of a local coastal Indian tribe. So Lewis and Clark allowed the members of the expedition to vote on a campsite for the winter. The site that was chosen was called Fort Clatsop in honor of a local coastal Indian tribe. And this vote became the first time in American history that both a black man and a woman, not just an Indian woman, but a woman, were allowed to vote. What was the first state to allow women to vote? Wyoming. Now that was, a long time after this. So think about it. Now, it was kind of a hard winter. Even though you think about it, they spent 4 months, December, January, February, March. They spent about 4 months at Fort Clatsop, and it was considered a hard winter. Did it snow all the time? What did it do? Listen seriously, all but 12 days of the 4 months they were there, guess what it did? Rain. All but 12 days, isn't that incredible? So the 4 months that they were stationed or camped or resting or whatever you want to call it at Fort Clatsop, all but 12 days of that 4 months it rained. So it was cold and damp and tough winter for them. It was better than snow, obviously, but it was a cold, cold winter in comparison to what it should have been. It rained all but 12 days of the 4 months spent there. Well, then the spring, what are they going to do?
Go back.
Return. So that takes us to our next subtopic, which is the return trip back to St. Louis. Well, it was on March 23rd of 1806 March 23rd of 1806, that the Corps of Discovery began its homeward journey. March 23rd, 1806, the Corps of Discovery began the homeward journey. Now, you think about it, what do they have to cross back over? They're going to go up the Columbia River, and then they're going to cross back over what? Lolo Pass. So it was interesting because the expedition followed the Columbia River, and they had to camp for almost a month before going over the Lolo Pass. Why? Too much snow on it, yeah. Kind of like the Beartooth Pass over by Red Lodge, Montana, and over in that area there. So they left March 23rd of 1806, and they traveled up the Columbia River, but they had to camp for nearly a month to wait for the snow to melt so they could get over the Lolo Pass, because they had to go back over the Lolo Pass. What's that? So they waited about a month and finally went over the Lolo Pass, and it was June 15th, 1806, when they had completed their journey and made it over Lolo Pass. So they left in March and did not get over Lolo Pass until June 15th, 1806. Now you might want to get your map out that I gave you that shows the return trip of the expedition, because we're going to have a little change. Now, when Lewis and Clark and the expedition got on the other side of Lolo Pass, Lewis and Clark decided they would split up and they would reunite at the mouth of the Yellowstone River. Okay? And Lewis said he was going to travel north back through Montana, and Clark was going to travel south back through Montana. So if you look at that map I gave you, the plan is they're going to split up. Lewis is going to take some men. Clark's going to take some men. Lewis is going to kind of restudy the northern part of Montana. Clark is going to go the southern route, and they're going to meet back at the mouth of the Yellowstone, where the Yellowstone River runs into what? The Missouri. Okay? Now normally I'd go into a whole bunch of detail on the return trip back, but I'm not going to do that because it is Montana and not Wyoming. But I will kind of give you some information. Both parties reached the mouth of the Yellowstone on the Missouri, and Clark noticed that Lewis was recovering from a gunshot wound. Okay? So when Lewis and Clark made their trip back through Montana, Lewis from the north, Clark from the south, when they reached the mouth of the Yellowstone and got back together, Clark noticed that Lewis was recovering from a gunshot wound. Well, what happened is when their travels were going along the Missouri River on the way back, Lewis and one of his men, Pierre Pete Cruzat, who was actually one-eyed, was blind in one eye, dressed up in elk skin and went into the brush to hunt. Okay? So Lewis and one-eyed Pierre Pete Cruzat, both dressed in elk skins, went into the brush to hunt. Well, for some reason, Cruzat, who didn't see real well, apparently mistook Lewis for an elk and shot him right in the buttocks. That's the wound that he was recovering from. So, one-eyed Pierre Pete Cruzat and Lewis go hunting in the brush. They're both dressed in elk skins. Well, Cruzat isn't seeing very good and mistakes Lewis for an elk and shoots him in the rear end. Now, although the wound was painful, no vital organs were damaged. Okay? So they're going to go from here back down. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I do want to talk a little bit about Clark and his return back. And you might be interested in seeing this because it's not too far away. During the time that Clark came back, they were traveling on the Yellowstone, and as they were going by, they noticed what they said was a remarkable rock, an incredibly tall rock right next to the river. Okay? And it was, if you ever seen it, it just doesn't look like it should be there. And it's just a great big rock. I mean, a huge rock, 100 feet high or so. And they stopped at that rock. And they named the rock Pompey's Tower. I'm just telling you the story. Now it's known more as Pompey's Pillar. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Who did they name it after? Pompey's... What? No. I'd really be impressed if you could figure this out.
Oh, the Roman...
No, it had something to do with people on the expedition, because who went with Clark southward? Sacagawea. What was her baby's name? Jean Baptiste, who Clark playfully nicknamed Pomp. And so the tower was named after Sacagawea's baby, whom Clark referred to as Pomp. Pompey's Tower, now known as Pompey's Pillar. Well, William Clark climbed about 3/4 of the way up that tower, and he signed his name and the date, July 25th, 1806, which is just as visible almost today as it was then. They have done a great job of preserving that, and they have a big, bulletproof glass case over the top of that at Pompey's Pillar in Montana. It's about 30 miles out of Billings East. If you ever get a chance to get to Billings and it's a nice day in the spring or the summer, talk to your parents, or you go drive that 30 miles and see that. It's really something to see. And you can see William Clark's autograph right on the tower. It's pretty cool. I mean, that's something that happened a long time ago. That's a huge historic part of this nation, especially of Montana. But it's really pretty cool to see. And they have an interpretive center, and they talk all about the Lewis and Clark expedition. So if you get a chance to go there sometime, and I'll tell you what I'm going to think about doing. When we take our trip and we're going to go to the Battle of the Little Bighorn and we're going to go to Fort Phil Kearny, I might slip us back and see on the way home we could take that little detour and go see that. I think you'd really enjoy seeing that. It's pretty cool.
Yes.
So we'll think about that. Okay, well, the expedition leaves the mouth of the Yellowstone and head back towards St. Louis down the Missouri River. Now they're going down the river, right? Is that correct, or are they going up the river? They're going down. It'll be easier. And where do you think they stopped first once they left the mouth of the Yellowstone? Where did they stop again? Mandan Villages. And who parted from the company at the Mandan Villages? Sacagawea, Toussaint Charbonneau, and the baby Pomp or Jean Baptiste. And they paid Charbonneau for his services and departed. Guess how much money he got in those days? I mean, $450, which was pretty good money in those days. Yeah, $450 is what Toussaint Charbonneau was paid for his services as a guide for the Lewis and Clark expedition. Okay, let's take us to the next subtopic then, which is the benefits of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So Toussaint Charbonneau was paid $450 for his services to Lewis and Clark. Yeah?
So we're not going to talk about John Boulder.
Not right now, not too much, yeah. Do I have them in there? No. It's just pretty tough because we're trying to, I mean, I could spend 6 weeks on this whole area if I want to, yeah. Okay, benefits of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was on September 23rd of 1806, September 23rd of 1806, that the Lewis and Clark expedition reached St. Louis. September 23rd, 1806. And I'm going to give you 8 examples of things that the expedition brought back from their long journey to show not only Thomas Jefferson, but members of Congress, etc., about the trip. So they returned to St. Louis, arrived on September 23rd, 1806, and here's 8 examples of things they brought back with them. And we'll just see how smart we are. So I'm going to start with Soraya over there. Soraya, what do you think something they might have brought back with them?
Plant specimens?
Very good. Samples of plants. Actually, Lewis had charted over 178 different plants on the expedition. Very good. Samples of plants. Lewis charted over 178 different plant samples that they brought back. Okay, Hannah, what else might you bring back? Bones of various animals. Very good. Bones of various animals. Mason, what else might you bring back? No, that's a good guess, but no, they probably did, but it wasn't maybe listed the 8 things of importance of the expedition. Think of something else. What else might you bring back? One of the reasons you took Clark with it. Yeah, brought back maps. That was the most important thing, maps. Maps. How about this? What else did they bring back? What they didn't call them books. What? Journals. Very good. Here's volume 1, 2, and 3 of History of the Expedition under the command of Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark. Partners in Discovery. Okay, journals. What else might you bring, Kyle? Maps, journals, samples of plants, bones of various animals. What else might you bring back? What'd they bring back from the moon landing? Thank you. Samples of various stones. Samples of various stones. Right? Would that be interesting for somebody to see from that country? Samples of various stones. What else would you bring back? Mackenzie, if you were with these guys, what might you want to bring back?
Water from the ocean.
That's a good guess, but that wasn't one of them. What else might you bring back? Quit being a tourist and start being an explorer. What would you bring? Shh. Mackenzie's turn.
Maybe like
Furs of various animals. Remember I told you Lewis had charted over 178 different plants? He charted over 122 different species of animal. So they brought furs back. Furs from animals. Various animals. Lewis charted over 122 different specimens of animals on the trip. So we got maps, journals, samples of plants, bones of various animals, furs of various animals, samples of various stones. What are 2 other things you might bring with you? Samples of. You're kind of close with the water, but not exactly. Soil. Samples of soil. Soil samples. Now you brought back plants and animals. What else might you bring samples of that you saw along the way besides plants and animals? Insects. Okay? Insects. So here are the 8 things that are of significance you need to know. They brought back maps, journals, samples of plants, 178 different ones charted by Lewis. Samples of insects, bones of various animals, furs of various animals. Lewis charted over 122 different species of animals. Soil samples, samples of various stones. Those were some of the things that were brought back. What did Clark do as soon as he got back? He did something.
I was gonna say.
He freed
York.
York. He freed York, although history will tell you that it actually took York 10 years to officially gain his freedom. But as far as his freedom as a slave for Clark, Clark freed him upon return. Okay? So let's kind of sum up the expedition. They traveled over 8,000 total miles. Over 8,000 total miles. It took them 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days. The expedition had traveled over 8,000 total miles over a period of 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days. The importance, the Lewis and Clark expedition had given President Thomas Jefferson the important information the United States needed about the vast territory of Louisiana. Yep.
Still the same subtopic.
Benefits of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Yep. So, it accomplished its goal without question. Very famously accomplished its goal. Okay, that'll take us then to our next subtopic, which is Lewis and Clark after the Corps of Discovery. Whatever happened to Lewis and Clark after this occurred? Lewis and Clark after the discovery. One had a very successful life and one did not. Okay? Upon his return home, Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory. Well, that'd be quite a responsibility, wouldn't it? That much territory. So upon his return home, Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory. Starts out pretty good for him. Later in life, he ran into some personal and political problems. He had severe bouts of depression. He ran into personal and political problems, suffered severe bouts of depression. What do people do when they get depressed sometimes? What? Well, maybe before that. Start drinking. Drank heavily. And he actually dosed himself with drugs that they had available at that time. There were different drugs like laudanum and all kinds of different things. And he got himself involved. Honestly, he became a heavy drinker and drug user. He also became suicidal and tried to kill himself several times. I don't know how you don't try very hard, but anyway. He became suicidal and tried to kill himself several times. And on a serious note, if you try to kill yourself and you do not succeed, then you are, to me, crying out for help. I mean, if you want to commit suicide and kill yourself, it's not that difficult. So he had ongoing problems to the point where he had tried to commit suicide several times. Now on October 11th, 1809, Lewis was on his way to Washington, D.C. And he died at a shabby cabin in Tennessee. So he was making his way to